I'm going to make 4 points. The first is to remind you that this project is part of something much bigger, which is, and I'm going to choose my words quite carefully, a renewal of interest in religion in the late modern world. This is not British. It's much, much broader than this. There are projects similar to this all over Europe, and we need to think, why is this happening? We also need to disentangle very, very carefully whether there has been a change in religion in late modernity, or whether there has simply been a change in our perception of religion. Personally, I think it's both. It is not true to say that God is back, because God never went away. But I do think religion is present in new ways which have demanded attention of social science. But we need to note the unexpectedness of it all. None of us was prepared for 79, 89, or 9/11. It took all social scientists and policymakers by surprise, which is a huge indictment of social science. Why did we not see these world-changing events on the horizon? We can, to an extent, say they didn't happen here, but migration, of course, brings them to our attention on a daily basis. So I think probably the separation of the West from the rest is not always helpful. Think what has been happening in Dresden today. Very, very alarming, I think. In 1960s, which I would see in the longer term as the peak of secular confidence. And then very, very quickly it all fell apart. The oil crisis, of course, was the catalyst. But what we also need to remember is the 1960s brought with it an exponential growth in social science. This was the decade when social science came of age, and it simply, in its philosophies beneath the various disciplines, assumed the secular. And this is deeply embedded in the philosophies of science, underneath sociology, political science, international relations, and go on and go on. The assumptions of modernity were the secular and the state. Now we are seeing the reappearance, at least the re-acknowledgement of religion and of the market. But I do urge you to take care with value judgments in both cases. There are good things about the state. There are good things about the secular. There are good things about religion, and there are good things about the market. It's when any of those notions become hegemonic that the difficulties arise. But the new situation has landed us in difficulty because we don't speak well about religion. And here we arrive at what is obviously a dominant theme in this session, which is the question of religious literacy. And what I want to do is to, as it were, add a further layer. I think all those interested in religious literacy, and there are many now, need to get together and work out a kind of division of interests, so that their concentrations are become more particular rather than too general. Because the things we've talked about this morning, of course, involve religious literacy, but they're specialised, they're quite difficult, and they're not the same as those that involve the education of children. And do remember, though, that the education of children does mean also the education of their parents. And so don't divide generation quite so sharply. And what about the re-emergence of the religious provider in welfare as the state retreats and the market advances? How do we deal well with religion in the field of welfare, and should you be lucky enough to get into your hospital, in the field of health? These are just as important, but they are rather different. And I also think that we need to think very carefully about the human rights discourse. We have falsely set off religious rights against secular rights. Now, this is not sensible, because the most fundamental human right is freedom of religion. And I think the way that that discourse has developed is an indication of religious illiteracy. But I don't think one group or one set of people can do all of those things, but we do need to know who's doing what and where the specialists are. One thing is absolutely clear, is the secular can no longer be assumed. This is where social science is in difficulty, because if you really begin to think carefully about the religious in social science, which is very, very closely built onto Enlightenment philosophy, if you go too far down that road, you are going to unpick, as it were, the edifice on which social science rests. But the re-emergence of religion in public debate has disconcerted advocates of the secular. And for this reason, I still think the most interesting place to look at in British society in terms of understanding the religious and the secular is the middle ground. Because whoever possesses the middle ground has a degree of power. I'll make one more short point. I want to draw to your attention a book I like very much. It's called Youth on Religion. It's a very, very refreshing read, because it's young people talking about their lives. They are in multicultural parts of Britain. Religion is important. They get cross with the media when they're misrepresented. They get along. It's in their families, it's in their schools, it's in their communities, it's in their nation, it's in the world. They know that. There's a lot of empirical data. I went to the launch of this book. I did that because I wrote the preface. And two people commented, and I'm not going to tell you who they are. One of them said, but because they're reasonable, they're but a step away from the secular. And the other one said, but you haven't told us about the dark side. I see these people as refreshing, good for them, common sense young people, giving me certain hope that it could work out well. The commentators were either seeing us on the slippery slope to the secular, or but a step away from damaging aspects of religion. So let us be careful as we perceive that we look through the right glasses. Thank you for your attention.